Welcome to our presentation on the three teleological arguments. The design argument, or teleological argument, has its name stemming from the words telos, meaning aim, and logos, meaning study of. It is an inductive, a posteriori argument that tries to persuade one of God's existence via empirical evidence that can be experienced in the world around us. There are two main forms of the teleological arguments: to design, or qua regularity, looking at a general pattern seen throughout the universe, and from design, or qua purpose, looking at specific examples in nature that have a purpose and trying to reason of a creator who created these things for that purpose. We will be looking specifically at the arguments of Thomas Aquinas, William Paley, and F.R. Tennant. Firstly, we have Aquinas' fifth way, an argument from qua regularity proposed in his book Summa Theologica as part of his 5 ways for proving God's existence. Influenced by the workings of Aristotle, he proposes an analogous argument, wherein the argument uses a parallel example to persuade others and allow a complex idea to become relatable. It runs as thus. Premise 1. We see things in the universe that lack intelligence moving towards an end. Premise 2. Things that lack intelligence cannot move towards their end unless someone with knowledge or intelligence directs them. Aquinas then uses an analogy to explain this. An arrow does not direct itself to a target, but an archer is needed. Therefore, it concludes there must be an intelligent being that directs all unintelligent things to their end, and this intelligent being must be God. Now, there are several criticisms of this idea, the first one being that the key premise of Aquinas is that things lacking intelligence cannot move towards their end, unless directed by someone. This first premise already assumes there must be an intelligent being who is already present, so the conclusion is close to being in the premise. Number 2 is proposed by Anthony Flew. He states that while there is a direction in Aquinas' arrow analogy, there is not this same intent seen in nature. For example, is there a direction seen from an acorn growing into an oak? Next we have William Paley's infamous watchmaker argument, proposed in his book Natural Theology. As implied, it is another analogous argument, but this time it argues from qua purpose, which simply states that design implies a designer. It can be summarized as follows. Whilst walking upon a heath, you might stumble upon a rock and ask yourself where it came from. Due to its simple nature, it is easy to believe that it had always been there, or that it had come about randomly. However, if you were to stumble upon a watch and ask the same question, you would have to think an intelligent designer had made it. This is because of the innate complexity of the watch. It is clear that each individual part works towards a purpose and is intricately interconnected with the other parts. Paley moves on and says that every manifestation of design, which existed in the watch, exists in the works of nature that we observe around us, essentially saying that we see the same complexities in the world, for example, the human eye, or many other parts of the body, and that it is ridiculous for us to assume that these just came around by pure luck, when, if we were to discover these things around us, we would have to assume that it was created by a designer. Paley goes on to say that this designer is God. Now, the first criticism of this came from Hume. He said, we have no experience of world making, and whilst we have experience of making complex machines, these are in no way comparable. We have no reason to believe that the creation of the world would be similar to the creation of machines, therefore it is ridiculous here to use an analogy. Number 2, this analogy is open to the creation of a caricature of God. We don't always end up with the Christian God that Paley would have intended. For example, it can suggest there are several designers of the universe, just like we might see in real life. Furthermore, if we look at how things are designed and created and replace this with the universe instead, it suggests we could be living in a prototype version, especially given the flaws that we can see around us, such as evil and suffering. This is an idea that many people are not so comfortable with, and would rather believe that we were living in the perfect world created by God. Number 3, false dichotomy. Paley suggests that things were either created by a designer or came about by pure luck as they were. He then states that it is far more likely the creator exists than it having been blind luck. However, he ignores a third option, natural selection and the theory of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin. In summary, design appears to have happened because anything that did not have the appearance of design has died off. Individuals that were not fit for survival simply did not make it on, whilst those that developed mutations that gave them better characteristics for survival pass these on in their genes, making it so what we see in nature today appears to be flawless. What is more likely, blind luck, a creator God, or a slow process of adaptation? Finally, we have the arguments of F.R. Tennant. both of which were proposed in his book Philosophical Theology in 1930. The first that we will be looking at is his aesthetic argument, arguing of God's existence from the human ability to perceive beauty. It runs as follows. Humans are able to perceive beauty in nature, art, music, and this presentation. However, such an ability is not inherently required for survival, nor does it give any form of an advantage in allowing a species to survive, and no other life form on Earth does so either. This means it should not have evolved because evolution only selects characteristics key to survival. From this, Tennant claims this is the result of a god, one who created the universe and wanted people to be able to appreciate his beauty in the world and worship him through the creation of arts. There are two key criticisms to this argument. Number one, beauty is something incredibly subjective to everyone, and God himself would not want to be bound by our perception of beauty. In fact, this would rather degrade God's absolute nature of perfection. Number two, when God made the world, did he perceive death, illness, and parasites beautiful? There are obvious imperfections in the world which, as proposed by John Stuart Mill, do not necessarily challenge God's existence, but do challenge his so-called omnipotent and omnibenevolent nature. Moving on, the second argument of Tennant's is his anthropic principle. The name comes from the focus of the argument, anthropic, which can be defined as the science and study of mankind. The argument claims that the universe was constructed specifically for the development of intelligent human life, and that minute changes could have led to life having no chance of developing as it is now. Rather than God directly creating us, he created the conditions for evolution to take place, beautifully merging science and religion. The argument itself can be split into two denominations, the strong anthropic principle and the weak anthropic principle. The prior states the universe was designed plainly for the purpose of supporting human life, and solely for this reason, whereas the latter states that human life developed by chance because of the fact that these conditions were met to do so. In both instances, however, Tennant concludes that the creator of the universe is God, and while a chaotic universe could have been possible, we live in a universe that is orderly instead, which provides some evidence for design. There are two criticisms to this argument. Number one, the strong anthropic principle argues heavily from hindsight, or in other words, overestimates its ability to have predicted something that could not have possibly been predicted. For example, it has taken millions of years for the Earth to have the correct conditions to support mankind, who itself has only existed for 30,000. To assume the world was made for man, as the anthropic principle does, is the same as saying the Eiffel Tower was made just so a spot of paint could be painted at the very top of itself. Number two, Epicurean theory, suggested by Epicurus, states that the universe given time developed from a chaotic system to an orderly one, at random, meaning there is no need for a god to have made the universe as it is. It is simpler to accept the idea of a universe without a god than introduce more entities to explain it. A posteriori